Welcome to the session, Adapting to the New Normal. Our facilitator for this discussion is Mr. Ashraf Mohammed, the Deputy Director General of ADB's Procurement, Portfolio and Financial Management Department. Mr. Mohammed, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the opening session on adapting to the new normal, and welcome to you all. What we want to do in this opening session is to share options for meeting the challenges under the new normal based on the emerging good practices in project design and implementation. Pre-COVID-19, when someone said that they hoped that you lived in interesting times, you were never quite sure whether it was a curse or a blessing. Well, we are certainly living in interesting times now. And I think 2020 quite clearly demonstrates that it wasn't a blessing. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge disruptive effect on all our lives. At the personal level, we have seen shutdowns, lockdowns, and having to learn to live with face masks, sanitizers, and social distancing. Some, unfortunately, have lost family members and friends who've died from the infection. At the economic level, in Asia at least, we've seen slowing in some cases or stop in manufacturing industries, high unemployment and underemployment. In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have impacted vulnerable populations disproportionately. We've seen severe disruption to supply chains. We've seen losses in national and international business, poor cash flow in markets, and almost total collapse of the tourist and hospitality industries across Asia. On the fiscal side, we've seen an increased government expenditure to cope with the crisis, both at the national level and at the subnational level, whilst experiencing significant reduction in revenue levels. It's also clear that the pandemic, nearly 9 months after the crisis started, that it's not going to end at any time soon. Whilst back in March, we may have hoped that this was going to be a short run or a sprint, we now realize that this is a marathon. It may still be too early to define the severity and scale of the impact of the pandemic and just as importantly, what a post-COVID-19 scenario would look like. But the current situation already provides opportunities for us to explore options in navigating what will be the new normal. And to do this, we must harness our experiences to date in order to develop and good practice to enable to rise to the challenges of COVID-19 and beyond. Today, to discuss these and pertinent issues, we have a very distinguished and eminent panel of ADB staff. So let me now introduce this panel. First, we have Mr. Bruno Carrasocco. Bruno is the Chief of the Governance Thematic Group in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. He worked extensively in South Asia, first as Principal and Financial Economist in 2003, then as Director for Country Coordination and Regional Cooperation in 2008, and finally as a Director of the Public Management, Financial Sector and Trade Division in 2010. On leave from ADB between 2000 and 2003, he worked as a senior economist at the European Central Bank. Bruno has a PhD in economics from Essex University, my wife's old college, and a master's degree in economics from the University of British Columbia. So welcome, Bruno. Next, we have Ramesh Sribamanyam. Ramesh is the Director General of ADB's Southeast Regional Department, where he oversees ADB's relationship and public sector work in all countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, as well as the sub-regional cooperation initiatives. He also represents ADB in the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on long-term investment in infrastructure development. With over 20 years of ADB's experience in ADB, he has worked on various projects across Asia Pacific. Ramesh has a PhD in economics from McMaster's University in Canada, with a postdoctoral fellowship in development economics and corporate finance in industry in Yale University in the US and the University of St. Andrew in Scotland in the UK. Thank you, Ramesh, and welcome. And then next we have Nianshan Zhang. Nianshan is the Deputy Director General of ADB's Central and West Asia Department, and before assuming his post, he was the region's advisor and head of the Portfolio Results for Safeguards and Gender Unit in CWRD. Nianshan has held various other positions in ADB, including a senior transport specialist, Senior Advisor to the President for Operations 1, and Deputy Country Director of ADB's Pakistan Resident Mission. He holds a master's degree in economics from the University of International Business and Economics, and has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of International Economics and Trade in the People's Republic of China. So welcome, Nyansha. Next, we have Emma Vive. Emma is the Deputy Director General of ADB's Pacific Department. She held various posts in the same department, including as Director of Social Sectors and Public Sector Management Division, in charge of the 14 Pacific Developing Member countries in the Pacific region. Emma also has served as the Australian Commonwealth Public Service and is an undergraduate degrees in agriculture science and economics from the University of Queensland and a master's degree in economics from the University of New England. Welcome, Emma. Last but not in any way least, we have Robert Guild. Robert is ADB's Chief Sector Officer for Transport, Energy, Urban and Water, Education, Health and Finance. So he knows a little bit about development. He's also responsible for managing several of the bank's bank-wide trust funds covering all sectors. Robert is an expert in infrastructure investment for socio-economic development and has provided advice to governments, the private sector, and multilateral institutions in Asia Pacific and Latin America. He holds degrees in civil engineering, public administration, urban and regional planning, and international development. So that is today's panel. So welcome to you all. Now, before I go to the panel to ask some pertinent questions on what is the new normal, I want to basically go have a quick look at the poll that everybody filled in, hopefully, just before the session started. Here we go. We asked the question, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear new normal in projects and operations? And this is how you answered. So 51% or over 51.5% said that health and safety protocols is what they regard as the new normal. Interesting also, changes in policy and processes, 22.1%. We also have project delays and cancellation, which has been basically the new normal for many people, as well as the increase in extensive use of ICT and technology. People are also looking for a more localized approach in terms of project implementation. And I think we'll touch upon that a little later in the discussion. And of course, as we all realize, there has been a greater inequality and substantial job losses. So I think this this shows actually a very good reflection in terms of perhaps our own experience and the experience of the panel in terms of what the new normal is. So let me move now to Bruno. As Chief of the Governance Thematic Group within ADB, Bruno, let's have a look at some of the overarching issues perhaps dealing with governance matters during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what do you see as the challenges in promoting governance and mitigating risks in this new normal? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. I'm delighted to be here on this exciting panel. I'd like to maybe cover 3 points to address your question and maybe finish off with an example and leave some questions. So to begin with, I think that to better understand the new normal and some of the challenges on governance and Operation Priority 6, we need to unpack the COVID-19 crisis. And I think there are essentially two readings. The first one is, I think, more akin to what came out in the survey results. It's really a health sector crisis and reflected the inability of government and primarily the health system to address some of the great challenges that were exposed through this pandemic. Now, if we keep to that reading, I think the solution is really to recognize that we need to strengthen a lot of investment into social infrastructure, particularly health and education. Now, there's a second reading, as appealing as the first one is, and that is that this COVID-19 crisis is really a multidimensional crisis. It started in the health sector, but it has now expanded, and it's a crisis of service delivery and of public sector. And as part of the need to address this, we need to look at both lives and livelihoods, and we need to look at it from a wider perspective. Now, if we turn to solutions, I think that if we are very much reading it as a crisis of service delivery, three fundamental points come to bear. One is that certainly in Asia Pacific, we need to continue to address the large infrastructure gaps that we face. And that is essential because that infrastructure underpins and anchors service delivery. There is a second point, and that is the need to strengthen efforts for countries to achieve their sustainable development goals. If we are successful in that endeavor, I think populations will be stronger and will be able to, countries will be able to address such external shocks more effectively. And thirdly, we need to be able to continue to build adaptation and resilience to address the climate change crisis. If we go to the great behavioral economist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, he talks about slow thinking and fast thinking. Well, taking that analogy to the crisis, we have a COVID-19 crisis, which is a fast evolving crisis. 50 million people worldwide have been infected, and we've got about 1 million deaths. That may increase. The climate change crisis is a slow crisis. We need to recognize that burning of fossil fuels will also significantly change our behavior, and we need to address that as well. So this comes to my second point, and that is that the development challenges, as clearly I think are visible from COVID-19, are much more complex than they used to be. And that I think is a fundamental starting point in how ADB should be addressing this, this new normal. I think Strategy 2030 recognizes this, and it is important to note that the Strategy 2030 is about leading through thematic groups. It's about taking a thematic approach to addressing development constraints and solutions and pointing towards an integrated and multidimensional solution to this crisis. I think that the sectors are super important, don't get me wrong, but I think that in some ways they need to work within more integrated thematic approaches. And I think if we can get that transformation right, I think we're going to move very fast in terms of addressing some of the constraints and picking up on these ideas of the new normal. I come now to my third point, and that's really about what does Operational Priority 6 say? Well, I could talk a lot about infrastructure governance and certainly the importance of improving the quality of infrastructure investments. There's been an IMF study that says that on average, developing countries lose about 30 to 34% of value in building investment in terms of inefficiencies. That can certainly be addressed and should be addressed. There's also a lot of discussion going back to the survey on multi-level governance. A lot of the services being delivered, and certainly in education and health, are at the subnational level. So that plays a very important role, and many countries have under-financed subnational governments. We can talk about domestic resource mobilization, we can talk about state-owned enterprise reform, but I think fundamentally at the end of the day, service delivery is really about mainstreaming governance, institutional capacity, certainly in our sector work, so that we're able to look at solutions that go beyond the building of infrastructure assets, integrating much more regulatory frameworks, looking much more at how capacity development in those institutions need to be strengthened. If we do these things right, we can add value for money, and I think we can certainly get there. I think the last point is that we need to enshrine much more knowledge in any solution, and that includes in all of our infrastructure projects. We certainly need to be able to move towards greater innovation and the whole idea of the transformative agenda that is embedded across the OPs. And of course, we need to be able to, going back to the governance of infrastructure, be able to leverage much more our filters. And by that, I mean, we have our social, environmental safeguards, we've got our gender policies, our procurement policies, we have our governance risk assessments. If we do that well, I think we'll be able to be in much greater shape to address that new normal. Let me perhaps end by referring to the experiences of our CPRO work. I truly think that this was a great example of how we at ADB can work as one ADB. And broadly, I think the quality of the projects was high. Now the question is, why can't we continue to work this way rather than revert to the silos? This is a question to all of us. I think part of the answer is that a project that was prepared is usually associated to Division X, Department Y, but this was really truly an emergency response from ADB, and that I think was made all the difference. Turning to my last point on questions, Going forward, we at ADB still face many challenges. So some of the points here, I'd like to perhaps to have some reflection on this in this panel. So the question is, how do we successfully transition to thematic approaches to our operations, as we, as well as the governments, are largely structured across sectors? How do we better integrate knowledge and innovation into our projects as part of the transformative agenda recognizes that there's still some ways to go in this area? How do we reinvigorate and cut across sector, thematic sector, and thematic agendas? The OPs, of course, are essential in this. And finally, how can we make better use of our operational instruments to better leverage our resources and have a greater impact? Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bruno. You've raised some very important and interesting issues. And I particularly like the idea of perhaps taking a much wider approach, moving away perhaps from sector to more thematic-based approach to projects, and in terms of preparing teams both within ADB and also with our counterparts perhaps in government as well. Thank you. Hi, welcome back, everybody. This just shows you that we are live. I'm sorry about that technical difficulty, but I think we're all back now. And also thank you to Bruno. I think that was a very interesting opening session. And I want to move now to Nianshan to discuss more at the project level, Nianshan, as to your experiences. And since you're the Deputy Director General of one of the geographically most large department that we have, running from Pakistan east all the way to the Georgia, so what have your experiences been in terms of the new normal? Nianshan.
Hi, thank you, Ashraf, for the opportunity to serve as a panelist. My greetings to every participant. Yeah, my department covers 10 countries, as Ashraf mentioned. We have 2 South Asian countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, 5 Central Asian republics. Then we have 3 South Caucasian countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. So overall, 10 countries, 365 million people. As in other countries, other regions, this region also takes a heavy suffering from COVID. So, and it takes not a huge risk to people's life and economic development. On a project, on the project specific level, we also have we are facing a huge risk in our and the interruptions of our normal so-called operations. So immediately, as a part of ADB action, CWRD worked closely with all countries to first provide emergency loans, technical assistance, and COVID countercyclical support. To support the country is to provide immediate capacity in PPEs, medical supplies, to expanding, strengthening hospitals, and to provide immediate relief and support to the poor people, vulnerable people, women, and to support SMEs to survive the crisis and to provide credit to business and to support trade. So this is a short-term and urgent assistance that is really well received. We provided 6 CPROs, and we are preparing another one ongoing, which is for Afghanistan. We supported the 3 emergency loans and grants. The daily practice in our project implementation that we are facing is twofold. Mostly in infrastructure projects, we face delayed mobilization of consultants. So the feasibility study, design are delayed, not only because of consultants, but also because the executing agencies themselves couldn't mobilize their people to do these all necessary designs. So the project processing is affected by different various degrees, and the construction, we face the situation that the international construction workers and contractors couldn't mobilize to the sites, and the visit to the project site was constrained, and there was a potential contract dispute. So what we CWRD did is we heavily and emergently relied and mobilized our resident missions, and local consultants, and we worked closely with the executing agency to review our project payment terms in one case to allow more flexible payment. And we also supported executing agencies and the contractors provide the necessary advice on possible contract dispute. This all was led by PBFD. our procurement department, and we fully supported that. So for the long term, we will continue under the new normal. We will continue and even more mobilize local capacity and resident missions, strengthening resident missions capacity, and support exiting agency and the government efforts to strengthen local consultancy capacity, local industry capacity. I saw there's a survey of local approach. That the local approach is high in our mind. And so recently we observed some ease of the risks, and some international contractors could mobilize now to some countries, and the dispute was diffused, was mediated at a very early stage. For future project design, we will continue and even more pay more attention to design the projects that has full consideration to climate change, resilience, and to provide the environment, and also provide healthy and the workers' health and welfare, and also design the projects in a more realistic way, considering more time planning for this project implementation. And we also will continue to pay safeguards to make sure the project takes care of the safeguards and to make the project sustainable and protect all people from being affected or for compensation to compensate. So our project, so for CWRD, we will fully implement ADB's strategy 2030, particularly for women, climate change, and sustainability, all these regional corporations. So last point I want to make is we feel that the regional cooperation is really, really more relevant and to our operations. So we observed this pandemic that the one suffering was a disruption of food supply chain, and also it also highlighted the need for regional public goods in cooperation. So as an operational department, all these are more enhanced in our priority, in our work. So I stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nianshan. That's a very interesting elucidation of the experience in CWRD. Before I move over to Ramesh and ask for his experiences in Southeast Asia, perhaps I can remind all of the participants that we will have a question and answer session a little later on, after each of the panelists have basically made their initial presentations. And please use the Q&A facility on your screens to ask those questions, and I will do my best at the end of the initial session to be able to relay those questions to the panelists, or even to myself if necessary. So thank you, please use that facility. And then let me move to Ramesh. Ramesh, of course, you're in Southeast Asia, or you're certainly the Director General of Southeast Asia. What has your experience been in the last 9 months under the new normal? Ramesh.
Ashraf, thanks so much for organizing this forum. If it had been normal times, we all would have been in one of our ADB big conference rooms, and it would have been so nice for us to walk down and meet our executing and implementing agencies, because this is one of the best forums that we organize that I've always looked forward to participating. But nonetheless, actually, it's fantastic still to see virtually our colleagues from the EAs and IAs from a number of countries, as well as ADB colleagues. Just a few perspectives before we look at what are the issues, the challenges that we are facing. What does it mean, particularly, if you're looking at Southeast Asia, yourself in your introduction, as well as what Bruno and Nianshan have covered, many of those points are applicable to Southeast Asia as well. A couple of things that I wanted to mention is clearly, in the first 2 to 3 months of the pandemic, as we all know, the challenge was how much of an economy or how much of the economies authorities need to keep open. So there was always this tussle, there was a dilemma between flattening the pandemic curve and flattening the recession curve. Now that dilemma still continues, it's not gone away. There is anecdotal evidence that is emerging across many countries that the functional capacity of economies still remains at about 60 to 70%. Now that's a huge shock in terms of economic impact on our countries. And that translates into obviously growth numbers. While for our outlook purposes, we bring out the projections, but once it kind of goes beyond, 2-3%, there is no point in talking about it because it's very pessimistic. Instead, it's much more productive to focus on what can economies do. But nonetheless, the short-term challenge, short-term risks that countries face, number one, huge revenue compression. Public, total domestic revenues have compressed so much that it poses immediately challenges in terms of where do countries go for resources. There in that context, ADB has what Nianshan has mentioned, and then what we have in the preamble for this workshop, a significant amount of resources that we have been able to provide. For Southeast Asia, for COVID alone, new assistance, new commitments now amount to about $5.4 billion. Through CPROS for $5 billion and remaining about $400 million in terms of health and direct social protection support that we've been able to do. Now, the second challenge that countries face, in addition to all this balancing act or the risks that they face, is expenditure reallocation. And here Bruno talked about infrastructure, as a key priority, and within that you are looking at green recovery. There is a concern that what started as a pandemic and turned into an economic crisis should not become an infrastructure crisis. So here you have hard as well as soft issues to look at. And here, if you're looking at in the short term, what are the challenges that countries facing? And here maybe mentioning a couple of points about institutional capacity, as well as what does it mean? What does the pandemic mean for, by way of implications for project design and implementation, Ashraf? I'll just mention a couple of points. The challenges or the risks are applicable to hard infrastructure, physical infrastructure projects, as well as soft infrastructure, i.e. social infrastructure type of projects. For instance, social protection, we have provided cash transfer support in many countries. But countries are grappling with, how do I provide assistance if kids have to go to school? Because physical schooling has obviously become a challenge. And at the same time, how do countries make sure that kids do get access to education? In the Philippines, for instance, they put in a lot of efforts to ensure that that last mile connectivity with regard to reaching out children in remote areas, that challenge can be met. And across a number of our countries, there are innovative solutions being found, but still significant risks in terms of delivering public services. And when it comes to hard physical infrastructure sectors, clearly in terms of whether it's ongoing projects or new projects, complying with regulatory norms, social distancing norms, ensuring that the health and safety of our executing implementing agency officials, as well as civil works contractors and ADB staff, to the extent that they're able to go to project sites, that does pose challenges. Now, in terms of, if we look at, if we want to return back to some form of normalcy, could we adopt a business as usual approach for project design and implementation? The answer is clearly no. So both in terms of anticipating and managing risks, as well as not losing out on the good opportunities that are presented by the pandemic for change. Clearly, business as usual is not going to work. Now, in this regard, what do we see as institutional capacity issues that are emerging? I think there are many aspects here. First, planning for the new normal itself. Here, I would say after the initial variation that we saw across countries in terms of responses and increasing number, I would say most of our executing and implementing agencies now have robust plans prepared in terms of dealing with the new normal. Second is intra-governmental coordination. This is within a country, if you look at, between planning, finance, oversight agencies, ministries of health, or other agencies that deal with pandemic, versus other parts of the government, the EAs and IAs that we deal at either infrastructure or education, health type of agencies. And one key aspect is reallocation of resources, because clearly countries have had to make some hard reprioritization of expenditures, and that involves a lot of coordination. That again, from a capacity point of view, we see things are improving. And the third area is capacity for greater public-private interface. Here we see in Southeast Asia, as well as talking to colleagues from other departments, there is a lot more that needs to happen. In terms of, for instance, exchange of information between public and private sectors, there is so much talk about big data, in terms of looking at the poverty impact and how poverty impact can be localized, and particularly in those areas which are under lockdown. Clearly, we need to rely on data exchanges, data and information exchanges. And fourth is the use of technology and digital solutions. I think here, many countries are catching up. Obviously, the capacity, the ability to fully utilize the solutions that are available depends on human capacity as well as the financial resources. And finally, I think analytical capacity to continuously evaluating the impact of the new normal, that is going to be very, very critical. And that is evolving in many EAs, IAs, but I think there is a lot more work to do. All of these have implications in terms of whether designing of projects and implementing them, new projects, that is, and probably more importantly, in the very immediate term, what does it mean for implementing ongoing projects? So this is something we are working very closely with our EAs and IAs, and there is a lot that needs to be done. Last point, I wanted to put in a plug in terms of new project design, helping countries in terms of allocating resources for priorities. That's going to be very important. And in that process, health, economic revival going to be very critical. But I think alongside, we also need to pave way for economic revival. And there, what role infrastructure can play, and particularly what role can green recovery type of solutions play, will become very, very important, Ashraf. Let me pause there, and we'll be happy to later exchange any views with you and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. I was really interested in hearing your thoughts in terms of the data exchanges. I think that's going to be a very important issue going forward. And I like the idea of now planning for the post-COVID and ensuring that we don't go back to what was business as usual. So thank you very much for that. I think now it'll be very interesting to hear a different perspective, this time from Emma Vive, who is the Deputy Director General of the Pacific Department within ADB. And of course, that means that she's dealing with a lot of small countries, small and fragile countries. So Emma, what are your experiences in this COVID-19 world?
Thank you so much, Ashraf, and good morning to everyone and to my fellow panelists. Listening to my colleagues, there's many similarities to what we're being experienced elsewhere and in the Pacific, but I think the major difference perhaps is that the impact of COVID hasn't been so much as a health event in the Pacific. In the region, the 14 Pacific countries actually closed their borders very, very early in the whole event, some late February, early March. And that meant there wasn't people coming and going, there wasn't transmission. And we've seen very few of the Pacific countries actually having COVID cases. Those that have, many caught them at the borders in quarantine facilities. And really at this stage, it's only Papua New Guinea that's grappling with COVID as an unfolding health crisis in the country. So I think that's a difference. And so when we start to look at some of the risks that are arising, I think it's important to keep that in mind. But it is very much unfolding as a socio-economic, quite frankly, disaster in the Pacific. The governments have never had to deal with a event so deep and so widespread across the economy. Surveys of businesses have shown numbers like 90% of businesses are being impacted. Job losses are huge, and some reports are showing poverty levels could fall back to where they were a decade ago. So just the scale of the impact and just how small countries deal with such a crisis, I think is a real risk of them just being overwhelmed. We're seeing really significant expenditures in the Pacific. ADB has been helping, as colleagues have pointed out, with CIPROs, other forms of grants, etc., have been really important in helping government build their response, and we've been working alongside of governments in doing so. But these expenditures are significant and they can't be kept up longer term at the rate of expenditure when revenues have been hit as hard as they have. So this thinking about where do we go next, how do we move from this immediate response phase into a more medium-term recovery phase and the longer-term development phase, I think is something governments are very much grappling with this at the moment, seeing their stimulus programs really starting to wrap up at various stages in 2021. And that's something we need to be helping them think through. How do they minimise the risks of such a transition? Pacific is always capacity strained, but this has really shone a spotlight on capacity in the Pacific. As borders started to be shut, many of the expatriates in the Pacific countries left. So we had project consultants leaving, advisors to government leaving. Many of these did try to work remotely with government, but not being there in country on a day-to-day basis means that the capacity supplementation usually provided just wasn't there to the extent. Governments needed to fall back on local consulting pools, which are very thin in country. They've had to try and develop new relationships online with new consultants they hadn't worked with before. And there's been a huge call on ADB staff time. I think we've been much more rolled up our sleeves, hands-on, in there with governments, talking to them, advising them, working through their needs alongside other development partners. And one positive thing is that we have been able to deliver on new projects this year. Governments have been keen to continue with infrastructure projects, both developing new ones as well as implementing the ones they have. It's certainly been a struggle, but we've been finding ways and means to do it. And that involves things like using drones to look at sites, relying on our Pacific country offices to go in, have the dialogue with government, feedback information, live streaming videos of what projects look like at the moment. All sorts of innovative ways have been tried to make virtual missions feel more like real missions and to get the real on the ground granular feel of how projects are going and what the issues are. I think we've struggled perhaps a bit in the safeguards area about how to do this over the longer term. And I think that's one area where we really need to think about. Something else we've been grappling with in the Pacific is some of the bottlenecks in decision making. Governments are having to make so many decisions simultaneously, and typically they've been used to doing this in a quite centralized fashion. Now we're seeing the need for line ministries to make quite substantial decisions quite quickly, and working through that new institutional process with government, I think, is an area that we need to focus on. Another issue that's come back into our project work is just the limitations to government reach in the Pacific. Governments had been engaging with the private sector with CSOs, but we've seen them need to do it to a heightened level in responding to COVID and rolling out stimulus packages. So helping government through how to build the relationships with CSOs, how to structure financing arrangements with them, reporting arrangements, as well as reaching out to the private sector in a different way. It was more in terms of what do businesses need to help keep them through this crisis and make sure the critical businesses come out at the other end to help with the growth. So I think these are some of the newer things that we're dealing with, and it makes us look a bit differently at our projects and think, how can we get more local benefit from the projects? How can we involve more local private sector, local employment, local consultants, and what needs to be done to ensure that this need for stimulating the economy through projects doesn't wind back on the quality of the projects in any way. And I think this is a very careful balance that had to be made. I think overall, in summary, we see also some changing demand from clients about what ADB wants. Very much a people-focused recovery. So some of the softer sectors, health, social protection, a lot of demand that we haven't seen to this degree before, as well as continuing need in economic areas, public finance, etc., but stretching out into how do they digitalize government services effectively? How can you effectively structure to bring in the private sector? These were areas that government hadn't paid that much attention to previously, and there's much more interest in it now. And thirdly, looking at resilient and sustainable recovery, and I think Ramesh touched upon this, but helping the Pacific in particular make more of what it does have, so the environment, the blue, the green economy, and how can this help governments to both diversify their economies and move forward into a recovery phase. And these things start to change how ADB works, or it should start to change how ADB works. I think the demand for us to be faster has always been there, but we've shown that we have been able to move faster in this COVID crisis. How can we continue to improve business processes, find ways to procure faster, find ways to get people into field faster? I think flexibility is the other thing that's being asked of us. While it's called a new normal, that's a sort of somewhat comforting term, I feel. It might make us feel good that normal is safe and reliable and we know what it is. But I think that the real fact of the matter is things are still changing quite quickly. We have to be flexible. We have to keep on top of what's happening, and we have to adapt what we're doing to meet changing needs of governments and countries. And finally, I think governments are looking to us to be forward thinking, help them decipher what the future might look like, what the opportunities are, what the options are, and to walk through this path with them as a reliable and trustworthy partner. So I think keeping these things in mind are quite critical as we design projects. Thanks, Ashraf.
Thank you, Emma. That was very interesting. I was very interested to also hear basically in terms of your experiences in dealing with governments and how they were coping on the ground in terms of their own capacity issues, the ability to make decisions, the ability to actually get their own people working in hand with ADB staff in terms of project implementation. These are challenges that we're all sort of facing at the moment. Before we go and move to Robert, I want to basically use this opportunity to look at basically some results of a social media tile that we put out earlier. Perhaps we can get that on the screen. Excellent. Here we go. So basically, ADB has committed, as mentioned by a number of speakers, 11.2 billion in grants and technical assistance and loans. And private sector assistance in developing member countries to address the impact of COVID-19. And really what people are asking us is what the rising to the challenge of COVID-19 means speed and flexibility in project design implementation, and what are our options? And I think all of you so far in terms of the project teams, and as well as Bruno actually, has mentioned that we need to be more flexible, we need to be more innovative, and we need to be more agile. And so let me turn to Robert, and who is the Chief Sector Officer, looking at across the board in terms of the cross-cutting issues, in terms of that flexibility and what our requirements require of us these days, Robert. So let me ask you that question, Robert. What should we do? What should we be doing differently now that we weren't doing before? Over.
Good. Thank you, Ashraf. I hope that you can hear me okay. And
Yes, thank you.
Make a sign if you can't. So both you and Emma have given me a great transition into what I was planning to talk about, which was the risks under the new normal, to the extent that there is any new normal, and what we can do about it. And to help assess this and to look for opportunities to respond, ADB is preparing a series of sector-specific guidance notes. So far, we've completed these for transport, energy, water, urban, and education. There's some more to come. And so I'll just really hit the headlines for each of those sectors. In transport, the risks and responses mostly involve public transport, including such obvious things as maintaining hygiene by physical distancing, face masks, and frequent cleaning, and meeting the demand for travel while reducing contact, which means reducing capacity. In the urban sector, we need to manage solid wastes and growing problem of medical wastes, particularly address the special needs of informal settlements where maintaining pandemic practices is almost impossible, and potentially repurposing some public facilities to provide options. In the water and energy sectors, there are real risks to continued operations of water, wastewater, and power utilities from reduced workforces caused by pandemic guidelines, particularly financial stress due to both commercial and residential demand dropping and many customers not paying their bills on time or at all, and significant medium-term risk from reduced maintenance as expenditure shifts to emergency response. And in education, the biggest risks are really continuity of learning while schools learn to operate in a blended online and in-person modes, supporting vulnerable students who struggle with connectivity, and maintaining healthy classrooms so that they don't become vectors. And in all of these notes, we recognize that while everybody has been affected, poor and vulnerable people such as women, the elderly, migrants, and people with disabilities are the most adversely affected. And these people can't make the private substitutes for public services that the pandemic has forced on a lot of us. And so how do we respond? I'll get to the details in just one more point, but I wanted to mention something about institutional capacity strengthening. My colleagues have already given a lot of great examples, so I crossed out two of mine, but there's one we didn't address, and that is the challenge of maintaining access to public services such as transport, water, and energy when the providers are either forced to reduce services or continue to suffer huge losses due to reduced demand. And this is doubly challenging where administrations have commercialized or privatized operators. And so two big problems that we're thinking about is it going to be necessary to restructure transport operators and utilities or provide subsidies so that they remain open and providing services and financially viable? And what do we do about operating models such as PPPs with demand side risk and take or pay provisions in power purchase agreements? And how do we start the conversation about restructuring those? These are big unknowns right now. And so let me turn to options for responding while still maintaining a long-term strategic focus. And in all of our guidance notes so far, we are thinking about the short and medium-term goals of enhancing health and safety, trying to create economic opportunity while still building resilience and livability. In the transport sector, this is going to be about public transport first and foremost, because it's going to be vital for economic reopening and for vulnerable populations. Active modes such as walking and cycling, we've seen here even in Manila, are growing, and particularly cities can plan for a greener recovery by investing in new infrastructure to facilitate things like bike lanes and more convenient walking and safer walking in many cities. Efforts in the urban sector can shift to enhancing inclusivity through social protection measures for the vulnerable, strengthening financial sustainability of local governments, and building capacities of urban institutions to focus more on healthy cities. And rejuvenation of water and energy sectors can be achieved through increasing green investments, particularly those that become possible through stimulus spending, accelerating progress on renewables and efficiency, and moving more towards decentralized solutions. In education, it's plain that we're going to see increasing use of ed tech as a necessity as schools move into more blended learning modes. And finally, it is clear that more public support for all of these services is going to be needed to ensure that everyone can access them regardless of their ownership and financing models. So I will stop there. Back to you, Ashraf.
Thank you very much, Robert, and huge amount of food for thought there in relation to your comments. We've received some questions from participants. And one of the sort of cross-cutting themes, basically, that is coming out is the use of technology, both in terms of during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. So I think this is a question to all of the panel, I think, in terms of what is ADB doing in terms of utilizing the new digital technologies, including blockchain technology for project implementation and contract administration? And is this something that we can see being accelerated in the coming months? Who wants to start off with that? Any volunteers, or shall I pick somebody? Robert, please.
I'll just give two examples, Ashraf. So one is in the finance sector, where we have accelerated our work on fintech, financial technology, to facilitate cross-border remittances through digital solutions to online banking, things like Know Your Customer. Emma will know the pilot project in PNG, where we're rolling out ways to do that even without internet connectivity full-time. Distribution of conditional cash transfers through using blockchain technology. So those are three examples in finance. In education, we're working at increased pace to find edtech solutions that can work in low-tech environments. So everybody's really familiar with things like Coursera and with managed assessment and personalized learning, but those don't always work when students are participating in classes from a cell phone, for example. And so we're working with a number of edtech companies around the world to find ways to deliver blended learning in more convenient fashion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Robert. And in Southeast Asia, Ramesh, we have some good technology hubs there. Can you give us any examples of where digital technology is being used in terms of projects or in terms of reacting to or recovering in terms of COVID-19?
Sure. A few examples, Ashraf. What Robert pointed out in terms of fintech education, clearly there are certainly progress that has been made even before COVID. But we are capitalizing on the work that has been done post-COVID, particularly. When it comes to blockchain, the specific question on blockchain technology for project implementation, that's kind of a broad term. But if you look at in terms of, take agriculture and natural resources sector, for instance, in terms of projects, what we are doing, say, biodiversity type of projects or for crop productivity enhancement type of projects that we do, there we are certainly looking at using AI type of solutions, including in terms of project oversight. Drones is a means, but in terms of getting mapping of data available from various multiple sources and using that for monitoring what is happening in our project sites, that's something we had begun to do, in fact, as part of the Greater Mekong Sub-Region program even before COVID, but that now we are fast tracking. Second is particularly for social and environmental safeguards under ADB safeguards policy, particularly for category A and some category B projects. A field inspection is so critical, and that's been quite challenging. Even our EA, IA officials have not been able to go to some of the project sites. And there, certainly, again, in terms of mapping data available from multiple sources, overlaying different sources of data, what can we learn? That is something we are looking at. In fact, recently, last week, we had a hackathon in terms of getting new ideas. where we had established players who were in the project design and implementation field, as well as tech startup companies came and provided some very interesting solutions. And here, I think there is a lot to learn from post-disaster management work that ourselves, as well as particularly UN agencies, have done. So that's something we are harvesting as well, particularly learning from that. Those are some things that come to mind, Ashraf. Clearly, on the business as usual point that I made, I think clearly what the pandemic has taught us is that for post-pandemic, for project implementation and supervision, we definitely need to bring in much more technology components into our work. What that means is we also need to work with our EAs and IAs in terms of setting up systems as well as building their capacity, Ashraf.
Excellent. Thank you, Ramesh. Nyanshan, do you want to add anything in terms of the...
Yes, thank you. Actually, we are very active in exploring technology in the project design and implementation, particularly infrastructure projects. So we are right now working on providing satellite image on transport projects in Afghanistan, not only because of COVID, but also because of difficult accessibility due to security, to monitor safeguards implementation and to match with construction progress. And in one of our projects, in the review mission, we carried out a virtual review mission that Action Agency actually used the drone to monitor the progress because people couldn't go there, COVID as well as other reasons. So to send back the images on these significant milestones. So to first to monitor. So I have to say this COVID pandemic is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for us to realize more the relevance and the need for high-level technology to work more with virtual and telecommunication, artificial intelligence. I stop here.
All right, thank you, Nyanshan. Let me also then move to another area which seems to be very pertinent with many of our participants. As we all know, one of the immediate effects of the COVID pandemic was the suspension of work on existing projects. I think all of our regions suffered that. And I know that my department, the PPFD, we basically issued a note in terms of the use of force majeure and basically the implications of both for contractors and employers in suspension of works. In relation to now remobilization of consultants and also of contractors, the question that's being asked is that clearly that suspension has a cost attached to it. Additional time, costs of remobilization, and the resumption of infrastructure projects will have basically all sorts of scope implications and, of course, increase in project implementation time. How flexible is ADB's guidelines on adjusting for these critical elements? And what about in terms of perhaps some sort of flexibility in relation to providing additional concessional financing for DMCs to cover these costs? Perhaps I can start off with Emma. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Thanks, Ashraf. This is certainly an issue that we and governments alongside us are grappling with. As I mentioned initially, many of the contractors have left Pacific countries. In some instances, it's possible for people to work remotely, provide advice remotely, but over the longer term, there's not much substitute in many instances for being there on the ground. We're making efforts to get consultants back in, looking at rescheduling projects, bringing in people for far longer periods of time than perhaps originally planned so that the quarantine issues often at either end start to make sense. But I think the expectation is that certainly the costs of implementing projects will have shifted somewhat. There are differences in it. Delays always bring extra costs, and this is something governments are certainly going to be talking to us about. In the Pacific, where many of the countries have a limited financing window with ADF, I think that means they're going to have to make decisions about where they want to allocate funds to, and it will mean some longer term development projects will be perhaps delayed for a bit, while we focus on ensuring that projects underway are delivered successfully and provide the benefits that they're intended to. But I think it will be, essential to talk through with governments just how they want to handle this, whether they want us to come up with extra money, they were looking to do that, or whether we bring other partners in. But I think we need to look through all the options and come up with an arrangement that suits the particular situation.
Thank you, Emma. A very good, comprehensive answer there. Nianshan, you mentioned at the beginning that CWRD staff had to deal with a number of these issues. Perhaps you can expand on those thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. We did experience withdrawal of consultants and stop of international contractors mobilization. So these are projects, not only the ongoing projects, many of them are affected, and also even new projects. Consulting service contracts are not implemented as scheduled. So all these things, I agree with Emma, all these delays come with cost. So we encourage all parties to look at these things under this current situation and come out with reasonable solutions. And for CWRD, we are definitely, to answer that question, we are flexible with solutions that are associated with the situation, like project extension, contract extension, and with more realistic time frame for project implementation. And if the situation comes to justify additional financing, we are quite positive to consider. So we fully understand that we are very sympathetic with the situation. I stop here.
All right, thank you, Nianshan. Bruno, I have a question for you. Somebody has asked, basically, you mentioned that ADB is on the transition stage from normal to new normal by a thematic approach for project implementation. How long will the transition take, and what could be the best approach on this together with stakeholders on the ground? Bruno.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. That's a good question, and I think that innovation in some ways addresses some shortcomings in terms of how we see things evolving. And I guess the first question that we need to ask ourselves is how soon are we going to get out of this pandemic? We've heard just yesterday some positive results with vaccines, and I think that largely if this situation continues for some time, I think those changes are going to be happening quicker than otherwise. But I do think that it does present, or there is an opportunity now to see how we can better work together. Some of the shortcomings that you've just raised in terms of not being able to work together because of the closing down of borders, the confinement. I think that brings out the need to reorient how we undertake our operations in some ways. I think that the role of SDCC is very much there to help in some ways join those dots. So we have the recognition that if we can build more entry points in terms of what I was referring to before, of integrating sectors and themes. We have a corporate TA that was just approved a month back that tries to bridge that gap. I think if we do that well, that will make a difference. I also think that in terms of the executing agencies, the implementing agencies, we need to recognize that now in some ways we are in that phase where, we've pretty much come to a conclusion with most of the CPROs, and we've trying to bring out a little bit of what's left in that pipeline that can easily, in some ways, come to closure and getting it approved. But then what happens next? And that's in some ways a challenge that we all face, and we certainly need to continue to support within the context of these new challenges. And again, I think that a lot of that work in terms of innovation, the digital solutions, will be a very important transition that I think will stay for the long run. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot of work still to be done with our DMCs to see how we can basically bring that about the new normal in terms of taking a wider approach in terms of both project design and project implementation. I have a question for Robert. Robert, we've been asked basically in terms of, you talked about reduction of risk notes in various sectors, the guidelines that have been provided. Will they be made available to EAs and IAs?
They're already available, Ashraf. You can find them on adb.org under publications as institutional documents. We are in the process now of typesetting and improving the graphics so that we can make them proper publications, but we've posted them already, the text, so that it's readily available.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so people can just go to the ADB website and find them there. Brilliant, thank you. I want to move on to more project level issues, and particularly a number of questions have been risen that in relation to results-based lending, which I know is quite prevalent with our regional departments, specifically in terms of how can we basically monitor disbursement-linked indicators, which is an essential part, of course, of the RBL product, given basically the very limited mobility that we have, and basically the lack of perhaps oversight in terms of some of the indicators themselves. Ramesh, do you want to deal with that first?
Sure. A very important question, Ashraf. In Southeast Asia, we do have a number of RBLs. The answer will vary from sector to sector. If you're looking at, for instance, agriculture and natural resources, where a lot of physical inspection will be needed for the DLI monitoring. And in many cases, we also have set out independent monitoring mechanisms where an external team has to go and based on what the EA or the IA can, information that they will provide to have that additional sort of layer of check and verification. So clearly there we are facing challenges, but having said that, what we have done is we do have local, this is where the survey that you posted at the beginning, we do need localized solutions. For example, the project itself may be implemented through a national oversight arrangement or mechanism. But if we rely particularly for getting results at the local level on local governments and institutions, arrangements that we may not have foreseen at the time of the project design, but we are being flexible if verifiable data can be provided. As I mentioned on that, in response to the technology question, can we overlay based on different sources of information and data that are available to verify the field reports that are coming? So that's something we are looking at in ANR. If it is in the social sectors, it seems to be somewhat easier because we have data that are available and which can be verified through multiple sources more easily without having to go and do field verification, for instance. So we do have RBLs in social sectors in Philippines, for instance, where we've been able to move ahead with probably less difficulties. So it really depends on sectors, Ashraf. Now, moving forward, there has also been a question that's coming from some of our countries. For post-COVID recovery, can we think about more RBL type of modalities? Particularly, you need local sort of economic revival boosters that need to be provided. Can we think more in our country programming? That's something we are looking at as well. And as part of that, we are looking at this whole monitoring issue very carefully. We do need to bring in technology solutions. I think anticipating that we may have problems of this type in the future, if not this pandemic, some other challenge, disasters may come. So in which case, the localized solutions also will become quite important, Ashraf. Those are some of the thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you, Ramesh. And as you were talking, actually, it occurred to me that one of the things I know that we're looking at is vaccine financing for our DMCs, and that also might lend itself to the results-based lending modality. But we'll have to see. I think basically moving on, we have a number of questions actually that basically hinge upon the use of local resources. And this is something that we've all touched on, I think, during the course of this discussion. And essentially, the question is has the pandemic actually finally shown that ADB relies too much on international consultants and international contractors? And that what are we doing now in terms of basically building up capacity within countries for them to do their own projects? Robert, do you want to start off the discussion?
Ashraf, I think it's probably better for the regional department representatives to tackle that one.
All right, so let me go to Ramesh. Ramesh, do you want to start off that one?
Sure. I think, it's true that we do for, bringing in international knowledge or cross-country knowledge, we do bring external or international expertise, but we've always had local or national consultants as well, to a significant extent in many projects. Of course, as our EAs and IA colleagues know, the remuneration issue always comes into play. So if you're looking at it from a dollar volume point of view, it may appear as less. But nonetheless, I think in terms of, if you look at many of our projects, the use of local expertise has certainly been growing. And I mentioned earlier on social and environmental safeguards. And that's clearly an area where we do need local expertise, people who know the local systems, practice, culture, and so on. So that is something we've always seen even pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, we are certainly experiencing that a lot more. Now, the thing that we need to keep in mind is even local consultants as officials, they're unable to go to, to travel in many of our countries. In Southeast Asia, Vietnam is an exception. Lao PDR to some extent, Lao PDR and Cambodia. In the Philippines, still in terms of ability of consultants to go, it is on a case-by-case, on a project-by-project basis. So I take the premise of it, but I do want to give comfort that the ratio, certainly the use of local consultants, national consultants, has been growing. But certainly, the pandemic will provide pointers which we'll be very happy to look at and address in our future project design, definitely.
All right, thank you, Ramesh. Nyansha, do you want to comment from Central and West Asia perspective?
Oh, yes, I do. So we have been encouraging using more local expertise and encourage development of local construction industry. So this has been what CWRD has been doing. But as Ramesh said, that there's a reality check here that is depends on the availability and capacity of a local expertise on certain areas. So certainly for safeguards, environment and the social, for all countries, we have our local expertise to support, to supplement international staff's work. But increasingly, we also enter into technical engineering design because in our region, technical design capacity historically has been quite robust under former Soviet Union, but they need to adapt to new design standards, of course. So depends on availability of local expertise. We encourage a mixture of international and national to serve the purpose. So definitely, given this situation, that we feel the more urgency to support the country to develop local capacity. I stop here.
Okay, thank you. And really, I think what would perhaps the question was also aiming at was to say, well, what is ADB doing to build institutional capacity within the DMCs for the future that it's not doing now? I.e., we need to basically change the way that we do business. So what is it that we can do to basically expedite the building of that institutional capacity for more domestic use, I suppose? Is there anything more that we can do that we're not doing now?
Ashraf, if I may, just for CWRD, we have several ongoing technical assistants, which we hire local consultants, and we also hire international consultants. And these internationals are based in the local, working together with exchange agencies. So by building capacity, working with them. So this is, I say, a very practical way to quickly growing up a local capacity. I just stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Lian Shen. And basically, I think we probably, let me just check my post. Just bear with me for 1 second. I want to make sure that I have not missed any. I've grouped questions together rather than individual questions. And basically, I'm just checking to see if there's any other sort of major issue in terms of that we need to look at. I think a lot of the questions I think we've dealt with in terms of local consultants and contractors. And I think there are a lot of project-specific issues which I would recommend participants actually speaking to their ADB liaison, because I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for us to deal with specific issues. But one question I think I can ask, and that is basically people have been asking to say, have actually any projects been cancelled due to COVID-19 in any particular region? So let me ask Ramesh. I know we've had suspensions, but have we had any cancellations because of COVID? Ramesh?
No, not because of COVID, Ashraf, but what we have done is at the request of some of the governments to look at ongoing projects that are particularly slow moving. If we can cancel the components that are not either performing well or slow moving, so that resources can be made available for that country, or it'll be available for through the broader pool for other countries through ADB. That we've done. Vietnam, for instance, has asked us, and we are looking at a fairly large chunk this year, about $500 million or so, and that approach, which also institutionally, ADB has looked at when we set up the COVID financing facility, the $20 billion that was approved. All departments were asked to, and we've been talking to our principal counterpart agencies to look at overall portfolio, but not because of COVID per se, but it is more in order to accommodate the financing needs for COVID.
Okay, thank you, Ramesh. Emma, any actual cancellations in your region?
No, not as yet, but I agree it has provided a good breathing space in projects to look at them, reassess where they're going, make any savings and make any changes needed. So I think that is one small positive that's come out of this whole event.
It's good housekeeping, basically, both for us and for the governments. Good. Lian Shen, let me ask you the same question. Have there been actually any cancellations because of COVID in your region?
No, the same answer as Ramesh and Emma. So we haven't done any cancellation because of COVID, but a few years ago, one project was suspended because of a non-compliance with safeguards policy. I stop.
That's very interesting, actually, because questions have also been asked in terms of the flexibility of our safeguards policy. Question is that given the current pandemic limitations on conducting public consultations with affected persons, and given the expiry of the loan effectiveness period, how flexible is ADB's safeguards policy in accommodating such challenges? Robert, maybe I can ask you that question.
I'm not a safeguards expert, but I have participated in some of the discussions, and I can say that the intention is very much to maximize our flexibility within the rules. So to the extent that we have discretion to extend deadlines, we will. And as we've already discussed, to mobilize local consultants and resident mission staff to help us in that. Both of those things are being done. Over.
Great, thank you. And I agree. We're actually having a review, I understand, of our safeguards policy at the moment anyway. So I think a lot of the lessons learned over the last few months will, I'm sure, inform themselves and be incorporated in that review as it carries on. I think we've run out of time, and I want to thank the participants who've asked questions and have been, actually all participants, for being patient because of the technical difficulties that we had earlier on, and specifically those participants who asked questions. I hope we've answered your questions succinctly and comprehensively, if both can be done at the same time. And I apologize for those questions that I may have missed out. But I would suggest actually keep the conversation going. Please discuss any issues that you have with your ADB counterparts. We want to hear from you. We're learning from you. So please keep those discussions going. I want to thank also the panelists today, this afternoon. And in terms of basically Bruno Carrasocco, Ramesh Sribamanyam, Nianshan Zhang, and of course Emma Viv, and last but of course never least, Robert Guild. So thank you very much, all of you, for a great discussion. Some very pertinent issues were discussed, and I'm sure the conversations will continue. Lastly, let me say goodbye to everybody, and keep safe and keep well, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in this session. We will have a 2.5 hour break. We hope you use the time to network with other participants in this forum. We've also prepared a game to make learning and networking fun and useful for you. Go to the Games and Quizzes page to access it. And don't forget to post your key takeaways from this forum in social media using the hashtag #RiseBeyondCovid. See you back online at 2:30.